Picture this. Madrid, September 1833. You're a palace physician, moving through corridors that smell like wax, stale incense, and fear. The guards won't meet your eyes. The chamberlain keeps wringing a lace handkerchief that's long since given up being white. Behind a velvet curtain, on a bed built to cradle the weight of monarchs and their sins, lies the man who once returned to the cheers of an empire and leaves to the mutters of a country that learned too late what it asked for. His name is Ferdinand VII, el deseado when he was a promise, el rey felón when he became the deed. Between his rattling breaths, between the priest's mumbled prayers and the queen's fixed stare, you can hear the ghost sounds of a decade. Iron shackles in cellars, papers torn from presses, shots on a Malaga beach. The reign is ending. The bill is not. Before diving into these buried chapters of power and humiliation, if you're into pulling back the silk and showing history's bruises, tap subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. I love that we're unsealing the past together from every corner of the world, refusing the sugarcoating and asking what it actually costs to build a throne. You're here for a mystery, right? The kind polite historians step around, the kind gossip feasts on. Was Ferdinand VII truly the most perverted king in history? A man whose private abnormalities twisted a public fate? The answer isn't tabloid simple. There is rumor, gleeful, cruel, persistent. And there is fact, hard, cold, documented. The truth lives in the friction between them. A monarch whose personal dysfunction, whether anatomical or spiritual, metastasized international trauma. And to understand how, you need to start before the whispering began, when Spain lit a candle in the dark and he blew it out. You start with a boy in a palace monastery. He's born at El Escorial on October 14, 1784, into the Bourbon line, a family tree that looks less like a forest and more like a hedge clipped into itself. A weak father, Charles IV. A formidable mother, Maria Luisa of Parma. A favorite, Godoy, whose rise irritates courtiers like a grain of sand in the royal eye. The boy watches, learns the math of power, subtract rivals, divide blame, multiply flatterers, add nothing that looks like a conscience. One day, he'll wear two nicknames like a mask and a verdict. El deseado, the desired. El rey felón, the felon. Then, 1808 happens, like a trapdoor. Napoleon plays chess with Europe and swipes a Spanish crown off the board. The tumults at Aranjuez and the abdications of Bayonne shove Charles IV and his son through a French doorway, and the desired king becomes a royal prisoner, useful as a symbol, useless as a sovereign, while Spain bleeds to keep the idea of him alive. 5 years later, after the war and the funerals and the ragged flags, Ferdinand comes home in 1814. Madrid weeps. Bells ring, balconies erupt with flowers, and in a gesture that will tell you everything you need to know about who he is, he looks at the Constitution of 1812, the miracle Cadiz wrote while cannons thundered, and he tears it apart like a letter that dared to correct him. Absolutism is back, and with it a style of rule that makes fear a policy and nostalgia a national program. The law that promised a modern Spain doesn't last a season in Ferdinand's hands. But Spain isn't finished arguing with him. In 1820, a colonel named Rafael del Riego lights the fuse that becomes the Trienio Liberal. The king, cornered by events, puts his hand on the constitution he hated and swears to it through clenched teeth. For 3 uneasy years, it looks like the country might scrape its way into a new century without carrying absolutism on its back. Ferdinand smiles for the paintings and writes for help. In 1823, help arrives wearing French uniforms and the name the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, a misnamed avalanche of soldiers who cross the border and privatize the king's restoration. Just like that, the Constitution is out, the prisons are in, and the ominous decade begins. 10 years of no wrapped in royal ribbon. What does a police state sound like? Like boots at midnight. Like door hinges that learn to cry softly. Like presses that print nothing but blank space because the words were taken away. You want bodies to fix it in time? Here they are. Riego, hanged in Madrid in November 1823, a lesson to the others. José María Torrijos, shot on the beach at Malaga in 1831, later preserved on a canvas so vast at the Prado that it pulls your breath out of your chest. Mariana Pineda, a seamstress who stitched a forbidden flag and paid for it with the garrote in Granada that same year, a name that still rings like a bell if you've ever walked her city. These are not rumors. These are dates, names, and places, and they tell you what Ferdinand's grotesque really means at scale. Not a bedroom curiosity, but a government that treats hope like contraband. Now, the part everyone whispers about, the thing people turn into jokes because it's easier to giggle than to face the dark math of power and pain. Whispers said Ferdinand carried an anatomical abnormality, a severe hypertrophy that made marital life a battlefield and succession a question mark. Later writers would repeat stories of physicians speaking in hushed clinical tones, of contraptions rumored to have been devised to make relations less injurious, of a king humiliated by his own body. Some 19th, 20th century accounts go further, quoting alleged descriptions and turning private agony into public spectacle. This is a place where responsible history must take a breath. Solid archival proof is scarce. Many details come through secondary or popular media. But the rumor exists, has persisted, and, true or not, shaped how contemporaries interpreted a very real crisis. 3 marriages without a surviving heir, a dynasty choking on its own biology. Look at the ledger. 1802, he marries Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. 2 pregnancies, in 1804 and 1805, both lost. 1816, he marries Maria Isabel of Portugal. A child lives 5 months, then dies. A second is stillborn. The queen dies in 1818. 1819, Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony. No surviving children. These are not rumors. These are the brutal facts of a nursery that won't fill, a crown that can't find a baby to anchor it to tomorrow. Imagine the pressure in those rooms, the doctors, the priests, the courtiers, and the silence afterward. And then in 1829, a 4th marriage. Maria Cristina of the 2 Sicilies, a woman who understood that the most political thing in Europe wasn't a treaty, it was a cradle. The next year, October 1830, a daughter, Isabella. The cheers weren't just for a baby, they were for an exit ramp from catastrophe. But even that needed a law bent to it. Ferdinand issued the Pragmatic Sanction, changing the rules so that a daughter could inherit the Spanish crown. His brother, Don Carlos, read that as theft. His supporters would turn it into war. 1 birth and 1 signature had rearranged the country's future like furniture in a room that was already on fire. What about the grotesque reign the title promised? Step into the ominous decade and take a look around. Presses shuttered, censors fat with work, informers learning the price of other people's courage, prisons full of men whose crime was to confuse tomorrow with the present tense. Spain's American colonies slipped away, money bled, regions stiffened into rival identities. The government treated every problem like a nail because it only allowed itself a hammer. Even if you ignored the whispers, the policy was its own obscenity, a conscious perversion of law into cudgel, of justice into costume, of kingship into a system that confused fear with order. And yet, because human stories never stay politely in their lanes, the palace was staging its own drama. In December 1829, Ferdinand married Maria Cristina. 3 years later, after the king's death, she secretly married again, this time to Agustin Fernando Muñoz, a young former guardsman. The wedding was quiet. The consequences weren't. Once it became public, it damaged her politically, colored the regency, and added fresh kindling to a bonfire of resentment already burning under Isabella's cradle. None of that is gossip. The dates and names are as real as the paper they're written on. Now, rewind to the rumor, because you have to deal with it, honestly. Spanish press pieces, popular histories, and television segments have repeated tales that physicians described an extreme hypertrophy and that a cushion, a ring-shaped support, was advised to minimize injury in marital relations. They cite alleged observations and even colorful 19th-century literary descriptions. But castle corridors minted malice as easily as coins. Popular outlets amplify what makes eyes widen. So you hold two truths at once. One, the marriage record and succession crisis are indisputable. Two, the intimate clinical specifics live in a fog of anecdote, retrospective embellishment, and second-hand testimony. Any historian worth the name will flag the difference. And the political point survives either way. A monarchy's most private room can become a public emergency overnight. Meantime, the bodies that define the decade refuse to be footnotes. Picture Riego's noose in La Cebada Square. Hear the volley that cuts down Torrijos and his companions on that Malaga sandbar, a scene Antonio Gisbert would turn into one of the Prado's great political canvases decades later. See Mariana Pineda's steady face as she mounts the scaffold in Granada because a piece of embroidered cloth scared a king. Those images can decorate coffee tables now. They were state policy then. What does the last year look like? Gout gnaws, paranoia hardens, Ferdinand signs and unsigns. Don Carlos's circle presses to undo the pragmatic sanction. The king wavers, then doubles back. Every paper he touches is a future battlefield. When he dies on September 29, 1833, the question isn't whether Spain will fight, it's where the first shots will echo. Answer? Almost immediately. The First Carlist War detonates in the argument between those who accept Isabella and those who want Carlos. The cradle becomes a front line. The queen becomes a regent. The country becomes a lesson in how long it takes to repair what one man can break in 10 years. And yes, the legend keeps breathing after he doesn't. People repeat that doctors preserved a scandalous relic in spirit. Others insist it's a vulgar myth. What is certain is simpler and sadder. His actual legacy did not need a jar to last. It's in the legal reversals, the gagged presses, the dead on beaches, the gallows in public squares, the civil war that arrived like the harvest after a season of sowing fear. The grotesque thing about Ferdinand's reign wasn't a body part. It was the deliberate inversion of a nation's forward motion, as if he believed history could be bullied into standing still. You want the intimate drama without violating the dignity of those women? Consider the numbers and the consequences. 3 queens, Maria Antonia, Maria Isabel, Maria Josefa, either miscarried, buried infants, or left no surviving issue. A 4th, Maria Cristina, finally presents a daughter and becomes architect of a legal workaround that keeps the crown in the line and puts a match to a tinderbox. The gossip focuses on the bedroom. The sober historian looks at the map and sees where the armies march because the nursery was empty too long. There's a reason the Prado hangs Gisbert's Torrijos like a door you can walk through. The painting isn't about brushwork. It's a secular altarpiece for a political religion. The belief that a country can choose law over fear and pay the cost in blood today so their children don't have to tomorrow. Stand under that canvas and feel how small you are beside the size of one decree, one execution order, one signature on a legal instrument that tells a toddler she's queen and tells a continent to pick a side. Should you accept the title you clicked on, Perverted Tyrant? Depends on your definition. If perversion is a giggling word about rumor, you're in the wrong video. If perversion means the turning aside of power from its purpose, the perversion of justice into a theater prop, of law into a truncheon, of kingship into a personal survival game, then yes, the crown sat on a man who made the nation bend in pain to fit his shape of rule. Sometimes the filthiest thing in a palace isn't hidden under sheets, it's written in decrees. Remember, too, that the most humiliating myths always sprout in the soil the target watered himself. Ferdinand encouraged a culture of secrecy and surveillance. Those systems always breed rumor the way stagnant water breeds insects. A ruler who prefers whispers to arguments gets swallowed by them. Press freedom isn't just a moral good, it's also a disinfectant. In the ominous decade, the windows were nailed shut. The air turned bad. What survives? Isabella II, child queen, a reign of storms. Maria Cristina, regent, scandal, exile, return. Don Carlos, banner, war, legend. And Spain staggering out of the 1830s with a long scar tissue of distrust. Look past the court comedy and count the real costs. Exile, gallows, bullets, the thick sadness of a generation whose best years were spent choosing between silence and prison. The liberal anthem that bears Riego's name, the plaza stones where Torrijos fell, and the quiet altar where Mariana Pineda is remembered, those are Ferdinand's monuments as surely as any statue. So here's how to read him without becoming what you hate. Hold the rumor at arm's length, note its persistence, and refuse to let lurid detail replace analysis. Fix your eye on the documented act. 1814, Constitution abolished. 1820, forced to restore it. 1823, French invasion restores him outright. 1823 to 1833, ominous decade, censorship, repression, the rule of a shrinking circle of loyalists who told the king he was always right until the only people left in the room were those who couldn't afford to say otherwise. 1830, a law rewritten so a daughter could reign. 1833, death. 1833 to 1839, civil war. Call that what you like, I call it the grotesque reign. And for the last time, because you deserve clarity, the intimate legend has legs in popular media, and specific outlets repeat alleged physician testimonies and the cushion story. Scholars who specialize in this period emphasize the paucity of primary clinical documentation, the tendency of court gossip to calcify into fact, and the need to treat sensational claims with tongs. You can acknowledge the rumor and still refuse to be ruled by it. If you need the scandal to make the history interesting, you weren't paying attention to the prisons and the beaches. At the end, when the physician in you finally puts down the quill and the mortuary salts, you realize what you have preserved is not a secret in a jar, but a cautionary tale. How a nation's future can be strangled by a single man's terror of modernity. How the smallest room in a palace can cast the longest shadow over a law. How a throne without legitimacy is a bomb with a slow fuse. Ferdinand VII didn't invent the darkness. He invited it in, locked the doors, and called it order. Walk out of that room, down the corridor, past the guards who still won't meet your eyes. Outside, Madrid's air tastes like smoke and the future. A child is queen, a mother is regent, an uncle is at war. In the sudden hush after a tyrant's last breath, you hear a country take one, shaky, angry, necessary. And if someone stops you to ask, was he the most perverted king? Don't answer with anatomy. Answer with the names of the dead, the pages of the law, and the years it took to climb back to a place where the word Constitution could be said without whispering.